I'm Mark Finkel-Pearl. This is Jeffrey Himes. And Jeffrey, I'm really excited today. Chuck Prophet. Um, Look, as people who go deep into music, you know this. Oftentimes we're asked, well, what are you listening to? What should I be listening to? And for those who don't know who Chuck Prophet is, that's really what you should be listening to. For your own damn good. This is a guy who has been writing great songs for 35 years and has had a very prolific solo career. To use all the cliches, he's a songwriter. He's a guitar player's guitar player. Tell us how you think about Chuck Prophet.
Well, yeah, I of course, like everybody, I first heard him at Green on Red back in the '80s, and I sort of followed him uh, through a solo career, probably not as closely as you have, but I've always enjoyed him, and especially liked his collaboration with Alejandro Escovedo on the Real Animal album, which was a sort of a high mark for both of those men. And I think that it's kind of artists here at Hard Rain and Pink Cadillacs we want to showcase. Someone who's an important artist but not overexposed and needs more exposure.
Yeah, this is a great interview. You especially asked a lot of questions that go very deep into his artistry and his method and his process. And so, without further ado, here we are with Chuck Prophet. Hey, Chuck, thank you so much for being part of this. As you know, Hard Rain and Pink Cadillacs is brand new, and we're just so thrilled that you agreed to come and talk to us. How are you?
I can't complain, Mark. I always enjoy chatting with you.
Well, thanks. I had the pleasure of seeing you perform songs from your new album, Wake the Dead, with Keen Sabe. You call those guys when they're with you the Cumbia Shoes. I went to 3 different gigs. Everyone was amazing. Some of this music comes out, I understand, of your cancer battle from last year. How are you doing with that? And tell us how this music connects to all of that struggle in your life.
Well, I guess it's really it's a gestation story, I mean, a lot of my curiosity about this Latin music, cumbia, which people say came out of Colombia, know, um, it really started during the pandemic because, like a lot of people, I was sidelined. I had a record in the can, so I wasn't really like actively writing, and just the cool part about the pandemic, anyways, was that it forced me to stop and it afforded me the time to do a lot of listening. And, cumbia music was something that I'd returned to a lot in that time. And I had a radio show and, I mean, listening like when you're 12, just laying on the carpet, getting to the end of a record and putting it on again. So it was that kind of thing. And I had encounters with the music. In fact, there's a club here in San Francisco called the Makeout Room, and a bunch of my friends work there, and it's a little place, but through the years, my band has played there, and one of the things that has always been a little bit of an issue is that when we play there on a Saturday, they want us to wind everything up by 9 o'clock, and they can be kind of aggressive about it. And we're like, "Hey, man, we just sold the place out. Can you just give us a little bit of a break here?" So, I remember one Saturday we finished the gig, and it was a pretty triumphant gig. I think Clem Burke came down and sat in with us and
Wow.
played the Flamin' Groovy song with him, and it
Uh-huh.
was just one of those nights where, it was a little bit triumphant, and we were all feeling good. So me and the band, we kinda stacked our equipment neatly in the corner and got it off the stage, And the reason is that Saturday night is cumbia night. That's a big moneymaker for the club, and it just gets packed, you know. So we were sitting there in those Naugahyde booths, and I was with Stephanie, my wife, who of course plays in my band, and people were coming in. Some were dancing alone, and it was still kind of sparse. And then people were dancing together, and some were dancing in the shadows. And then my drummer, Vicente, who is from San Antonio and has played a lot of Latin music, he was out showing Stephanie some really rudimentary, dance moves. And the cumbia music the DJs were playing was coming through the sound system, and the low end and the bass lines were coming through the subs. And I just didn't want the night to end, and that was when I started to have a heightened awareness of the music. And I would return to that Saturday nights there sometimes, just hang out and listen to music. So,
Let me ask you this, Chuck. I mean, when you describe this in interviews, it often sounds analogous to, when you were a young kid, grew up on the Beach Boys, and you discovered country music or you discovered reggae. Is it analogous to that?
well, sure, I mean, I think punk rock came along and it encouraged anybody and everybody to pick up an instrument. But it was really the Clash, by the time they got to London Calling, that showed what you could do with it. And that album is sort of the gateway drug for me in many ways. It's got disco on it. It's got ska, reggae, rockabilly, and roots music, really, And so that had a pretty big effect on me. And, it was really the Clash that said, "Oh, check out Joe Ely," and "Oh, what is this? Is this country music? I don't know. Check out Townes Van Zandt. Check out Graham Parsons," which was which took some doing back then. This guy, Mark Plummer, was a British guy who managed Chris Isaak and lived in the Upper Haight. He would dress in a 3-piece suit every day. He looked like a 40s film star. He looked like Ray Milland or somebody, And me and a friend of mine used to go over to his apartment, just knock on the door and say, "Hey, can we listen to that Graham Parsons record?" He'd say, "Yeah, that's cool." We'd just sit on the couch and he, ash our cigarettes in an ashtray on the coffee table. He didn't care. And that's kind of what it was like, seeking this stuff out on some level. So yeah, I suppose my my romance with this Latin music was much like that.
And why did it sort of strike home at that time in the way that it did?
Well, a lot of it's in Spanish. There's also cumbia dub music, and there's no lyrics to take you anywhere. And also, I'm very kind of analytical about words. And so you can really lose yourself in the music. There's also this kind of, there's just characteristics, this kind of almost, I don't know what it is, if it's like, I don't know, it's almost like Arabic, chromatic music that is, really kind of lends itself to like surf guitar and so many things about it that are cool.
And it was dance music when you were stuck at home.
Yeah, absolutely. And eventually when I met up with these guys, Key and Save, who I followed around a little bit, and they said, "Hey, come on down to Salinas, we got a house in the woods. You can turn up as loud as you want." And for an apartment dweller like me, that's a real treat. So I took them up on it, and we would jam and stuff. And we eventually played a gig together in Big Sur at like a hippie festival. And that's when I discovered, having a dance band is pretty cool. It's a lot more visceral than saying about your coffee getting cold or whatever. I don't know, whatever singer-songwriter cliches that stack up, but it was really exciting. And one of the things that having a dance band is analogous to is It reminds me of what Alejandro Escovedo said about the dawn of punk rock. And what it did was it erased the line between the stage and the audience, where the people in the audience were just as interesting on the stage. And, and so yeah, I really whatever it was that happened, I walked away from that day thinking, oh, I want to do more of that.
And when you had the cancer scare, how did it? Was it kind of medicine or?
Yeah, definitely, it would get me out of my head. Like I said, especially like the cumbia dub and the things that didn't have lyrics or were in Spanish. I could really get lost. You want to get out of your head. How do you get people talk about being mindfulness, and how do you get to that place, meditative place, where you're just there? So yeah, it was a comfort to me. And I got pretty evangelical about it. I wanted everybody to listen to it. That's kind of obnoxious, but that's the way I am. I'm an enthusiast.
So when you started writing songs to that music, putting your lyrics on top, what was the challenges there?
I think one of the things that distinguishes this record is that my instincts as a songwriter are still very classicist, in the sense that, I think Dave Hickey described it this way. He said, a verse is like where you feed people and then you give them, chorus comes and it's like you give them a cookie, and then you take them to a verse and they're waiting, and then the cookie comes back, and he goes, and then, when they've gotten used to the cookie, you take it away and you go into a bridge, and finally, you give them the cookie back. So there's all that sort of brill building classicism that I'm a real slave to. So even though a lot of this chicha music, which is that particularly cool surf music, that's on the cumbia family tree or whatever you want, all these things overlap, sambas and bossa novas, cumbia, but it's really fun music to play.
But how do you put those two things together? I guess what I'm asking.
Oh, well, I guess what I'm saying is that because a lot of that music is based on one chord, I was only able to go so far with that before my instincts kicked in. So, there may be cumbia grooves under the feet of these songs, but the songs are pretty Chuck Prophet. That my values are intact. And putting the groove underneath it, I think, is what makes this record pretty.
Can you give an example of one song, but how that worked? How you started with a groove?
Yeah, it's like the first song, "Wake the Dead," is a shot across the bow. You've got the classic Weta percussion. Then you hear, the 3-note bass line, boom, 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 and then a kind of a guitar figure, sort of chromatic guitar figure, and then we're off and running. We got a verse, we got a chorus, we got a verse, we go somewhere for a while to a solo or something, then we come back and we repeat the chorus. So that song really is a proof of concept. And it really comes out, the album comes out of the gate with it.
Right.
Couldn't imagine any other song really opening the record.
Let's go back to the beginning for a minute and then work our way back up. You and I have talked at length about your origin story, your move from Southern California to Northern California at a very pivotal moment in your adolescence. Eventually, you meet Dan Stewart, you join Green on Red, and that band was very influential in, what many people term Paisley Underground, Southern California sound. And then what we haven't talked a lot about, you and me, in the past is that move to the solo career. Talk about when you decided that Green on Red had run its course for you, and how were you thinking about a solo career and launching a solo career?
Well, I've made a record called Brother Aldo, and listening to that record now, it just sounds like somebody trying to figure all that out. there were things along the line that inspired. I mean, I was in, yeah, Green on Red, but we kind of went out of business probably in about 1987 or 8. You know, we were on our second record for a major label. We ran up against all those things that bands run into. They fire their drummer. You kind of hit a wall. You sort of hit a wall with your limitations. You know, what got us in position to get that deal wasn't getting us to the next place, you know, and all that energy that you spend fighting the world, you know, you can start to turn on each other with that same energy and that same kind of passion, you know. So Green on Red kind of, we sort of broke up. In fact, the original lineup, we all went our separate ways after an album called The Killer Inside in about 1987 or so. That's the way I remember it. I ended up going to Berlin for a while. And when I came back, I mean, I just ended up having falling into a kind of a poker night with some other songwriters. And Stephen Yerke, who's just a phenomenal songwriter, Patrick Winningham, Stephanie's ex-boyfriend, who is a great songwriter, wrote a couple songs that the County Crows have covered. Mark Eitzel, Barbara Manning. We used to play at a place called the Albion, and there was a back room, like a little back room, and a tiny little PA. And so we would, you know, play with each other, and almost like a traveling Wilburys kind of a thing. And we were writing songs together, and then it just became logical to try to document that stuff. And so I recorded a few of those songs. There was a label in England that wanted to do a record, and I mean, I was just figuring it out, you know. I mean, but it was definitely a reaction. Green on Red, our last record with the original lineup, you know, was pretty bombastic, maybe a little overproduced, big crashing gated reverbs, which were pretty exciting on some level. And I hear it now, I'm like, I get where we were coming from. We didn't want to sound tasteful. We didn't want to sound like the Eagles, you know. We liked that it was exciting. But I think I was reacting to that. So I was listening to a lot of stuff like the Basement Tapes. And, you know, I thought, well, it would be really great to make a record that was really, you know, underproduced in that way. Just a verite or whatever. And that was really the goal with my first record. And I wanted all my friends on, you know, like Stephanie and Patrick and Steve Yerke and stuff like that. So that's kind of what happened, you know. And then another deal came along, and, you know, we expanded. We started going on tour. We started going, you know, Stephanie and I put a band together, and we started touring up and down the Angry Island. You know, we played a lot of gigs a lot of gigs in the UK, a lot of pubs, and a
Well,
lot of gigs here too. You know?
let me ask you this: when, you know, what did you take away from Green on Red that was valuable, and what did you want to do different when you were on your own?
It's hard to say. I mean, so much, you know, Green on Red, we were all kind of learning as we went along. Dan Stewart was a wildly entertaining guy, you know, contrarian amongst the contrarians, you know, and, you know, and we ended up flirting with all kinds of music. But I think I wanted to simplify my life, honestly.
In what sense, simplified?
Well, you know, when you get in a band and there's management and there's a major label deal and all these things, you know, it's like the Titanic, you know, if somebody says, hey, can we take a left over here and can we pull over? No, you can't pull over. No, you got to get approval for that. You got to go through the chain of command, you know? So I think I really enjoyed playing in a spontaneous way, completely stripped back with my friends. There was something about that. And we got a little bit competitive with the songwriting. You know, you might write a song on a Wednesday, play it on a Saturday, find yourself patching it up on the Sunday and you know, patching the holes. And so I think that was something that I was hungry for at the time. No discredit to Green on Red. And Dan Stewart and I, we ended up continuing. There was just that initial break where the band broke up, and then we were offered a deal by a British indie label called Red Rhino that had like the Sisters of Mercy and the Mekons, and it's an interesting label out of Leeds. And so Danny and I went to Memphis and made a record called Here Come the Snakes with Jim Dickinson. And that really became what Danny Stewart refers to as the Godfather 2 years. So, and some people like the Godfather 2 better than the first one. I think I'm among.
So that, and then with the second record, you really sort of established what you might call the Chuck Prophet sort of template. That's really where I think you can look back and you can say, wow, that sort of power pop sound, that kind of songwriting that he does, kind of guitar playing you do, really originates there. And then, through that body of work up until the present day, you're now this sort of, songwriter, and all the cliches, guitar player, and all that. What was your intention back then as you started embarking on that second record and onward?
Well, I had seen people like Richard Thompson, back when he was in an Econoline. So
Right.
I saw them play at the old Waldorf here. He had like a 5-piece band. He had a guy playing button accordion and 2 guitars, bass drums, button accordion, and a girl singer. And he would trade solos with the button accordion. Like they would 4 bars or whatever they call it. And I just thought it was incredibly exciting, and I thought, well, this is what you do. This is how you do it. And so that's what I can, I saw that band and I thought, well, that's really how you do it. So that was probably a big influence on me. He was certainly a big influence on me in many ways. He would do these kind of Irish sounding songs and then take a Chuck Berry solo in the middle, or a Chuck Berry kind of song, and he would play sort of a bagpipe solo on guitar. All that was really fascinating to me. I was heavily under the influence of Richard Thompson, especially those. Not to mention, the guys, Van Morrison, Bob Dylan, of course, and Neil Young, all that stuff. But all roads sort of lead to Dylan, I think.
And
in many ways.
When you come out of punk rock and the sort of, skeptical attitude about, classic rock and conventional wisdom, and then you become more ambitious as a songwriter and want to try some of those more ambitious things that those guys are doing, how do you blend those two things without sort of losing that sort of attitude, that Ramones attitude?
One of my, initial encounters with punk rock was, even the Maximum Rock and Roll show that came out of Berkeley or Cal-X, I think. They would play like Kinks B-sides, and they would play like rockabilly records.
Mm-hmm.
They would run out of local records to play. And so, that informed what I was doing in many ways, Springsteen as well. Dwayne Eddy guitar and these kind of things. But, I went to a place called the Temple Beautiful when I was 16 or so. And I've talked about this a lot, but it was an old synagogue that had fallen into disrepair on Geary Street. And I think I'd heard about it on the radio on the Maximum Rock and Roll show or whatever. And, I saw Wall of Voodoo, the Flamin' Groovies, Black Randy and the Metro Squad, the Mentors. I saw these bands like Wall of Voodoo before they had a record out. So you had Stan Ridgway stalking the stage and like Jimmy Cagney or something with a bullhorn, a radio, and like a beatbox from your grandma's organ, one of those kind of things. And the guy was playing a surf guitar, I think a Jaguar, into a Fender Reverb outboard, unit, dimed, and kind of spaghetti western. And that was the same night I saw the Mentors, who came out with Executioner hoods, and a hideous band. It made me very uncomfortable. But the punk rock that I came from was very eclectic, and it was also reflected in like the way people dressed and the way the girls dressed, and a kind of a thrift store chic. But by 1981, when hardcore came along, I became very disinterested in punk rock, in American hardcore. I didn't have time for the Bad Brains or Minor Threat or any of that. I just didn't. At this point, I certainly wasn't gonna throw away my Jimi Hendrix records. It's not gonna happen. So, I'm a little unique in that respect, and I think my biggest heroes out of that era were probably the Rubinoos, who I talk about them the way people east of the Mississippi talk about NRBQ or something. When I started going to Nashville, everybody goes, "Oh my God, Chuck, NRBQ." I'm like, okay. Can we talk about something else? And people, there's a whole church around, and that's kind of what it was like for the Rubinists, because they would play, a theme they would play an Ennio Morricone composition,
Right.
as well as a sort of a doo-wop a cappella, and their kind of sarcastic rock and you just didn't know that it was the breadth of the canon of American music, and a lot of it would go back to that sort of nuggets.
Right.
But they sang in tune, four guys singing in tune, and they were a kind of a cross between the Beach Boys and the Jackson 5. and also very professional, so they had a pretty big influence on.
And you ended up doing a record with them.
Well, absolutely, yeah. About 3 or 4 years ago, I wrote an entire record with their principal songwriter, Tommy Dunbar, produced it, and we produced it. When I say I produced it, really all I did was ask a lot of questions about how they made their first 2 records, and I said, well, we're gonna do that. And it turns out they rehearsed, for a bunch of 9th grade dropouts, they rehearsed every day.
And what was the name of that record?
From Home.
The other thing one of the things that sort of struck me when you talk like this is that, I have this theory about how, artists evolve, and there's sort of the subtractive approach and the sort of addition approach, where some people throw out the stuff they used to like and replace it with something new, and other people sort of keep what they used to like and add something new to it. And it sounds like you're in that latter camp.
Yeah, I suppose, yeah. I have a pretty good appetite for music. And so all that stuff works its way into what you're doing. And, I'm 14 albums deep, they tell me. I'm not sure, actually. And then maybe another 10 Green on Red records or whatever. But the idea has always been, if you're lucky enough to write 2 or 3 songs that take you somewhere you feel like you haven't been before, then maybe you might wake up in the morning a little bit excited about it, and that can turn into, making a record. And that probably hasn't changed.
One other thing is that, something that runs through your career, starting with Green on Red, is a sort of an awareness of sort of social political issues, but not in terms of slogans, but in terms of stories about people who get caught up in those situations.
Well, I should credit. Of course, I've co-written so many songs with Kurt Lipschutz, and he deserves a lot of credit for content and where things go. And but I suppose that does go back to Dan Stewart. He had these songs like Old Chief, that was a kind of a photograph of somebody on the street that had a backstory. He had a song called Brave Generation, which was very audacious, about, our generation. who didn't fight in Vietnam, who didn't, you know, I mean, very social. And I suppose that really drew me into what they were doing in a lot of ways. I mean, so much of the Paisley Underground, it's like, gets mixed up with that kind of Marshmallow Overcoat, you know, silly, psychedelic stuff. But also, yeah, Dan had a social. He had an eye for that.
Mhm.
He was took some great photographs lyrically,
Yeah.
and so he really deserves credit for that. And, you know, I don't know. I'd have to look at my songs and say, oh, this is social, and this isn't.
Mm.
You know, there is a kind of um something to strive for in terms of records that know what time it is.
Chuck, let's talk a little bit about your relationship with Alejandro and how that formed. And, you wrote at least an album's worth, if not more than an album's worth of material with him. You were on Real Animal, which is considered a real high watermark in his career, produced by Tony Visconti. Talk about that and how it all happened.
Well, Alejandro and I had known each other for years. I mean, I'm not really sure when we met. I did see Rank and File play, and it was pretty legendary. I saw them play here in town, opening for DOA. And when they came out on stage, I mean, they had cred because, Chip and Tony had been in the Dills, and they were sort of a first wave punk band. But the punk rockers were a little confused when they came out and, were playing that whole boom chicka boom kind of feel. But that's when I saw Alejandro. He would play guitar and Rank and File, and I don't know, I just clocked him. I thought he was, you know, it was hard to take your eyes off him. So we became friends through the years. Not really sure when and how, but if I saw him, he would say, "Oh, let me get you a shot at the bar," and we'd start talking like we'd known each other for forever, our whole lives. And that probably says a lot about Al. He can make you feel that way. He's either he's warm or he's a sociopath. I don't know, somewhere in between. And around 2007 or so, we were playing some gigs, and we did like a double bill in California. And he approached me and said, "Hey, I really want to write an album. I thought maybe we could write some songs together." And I said, "Yeah, we can try." So that started a relationship. I went out to Texas, and he was living in the hill country at the time. And the first day we got together, we wrote a couple songs, pretty good ones, and then Alejandro would make his way out to San Francisco, where I have a so-called office, which is really just an overpriced shoebox south of Market. And we would kick song ideas around, or we would put on a Mott the Hoople record and lay on the carpet, and Al would get out his vaporizer. But it was, even when it wasn't clicking, I'd say, "What do you think?" He said, "Oh, this is, don't worry, this is all part of it." So, I mean, Al, to his credit, he has that monster faith. "Oh, you Caucasians worry too much. It'll work. It'll work out." And I say, "I don't know about that bridge. What are we gonna do? It doesn't sound coming. Yeah, it'll work out." So, we really enjoyed each other's company, and Alejandro is just wonderful company. And, we would listen to records and tell each other stories, and we might put on a drum machine and crank it through a guitar amp and, jump around the room, riffing on a 96 Tears kind of riff that might mutate into something else. And that's really where those songs came from.
Can you describe in detail, Always a Friend, how that song, just like one of the decade's best songs.
I definitely had those two chords that went back and forth, the major seventh chord to the 4 chord, and I definitely had "Wasn't I Always a Friend to You? Wasn't I Always a Friend to You? Do you want to be my friend?" And we initially sort of punched that up and it was a sort of a mid-tempo, strummy major seventh chord kind of thing, you know, in a more of a Pale Blue Eyes tradition. And when we showed it to the band, they kept speeding it up, you know, and it was kind of frustrating because it ended up sort of in the cracks. I thought, oh, these guys, you know, Hector, fantastic drummer in Al's band, these guys are playing it too fast, you know. And so finally, out of frustration, you know, this kind of thing, you know, became, you know, I just, out of frustration, I went like, with the same two chords, but I put that graphic shape to it, you know. And later I realized I was just channeling this song, you know. I don't know what that song is. You know that song?
Oh man, it's so familiar.
I think it's called "It's All Right" or something. It's all right. It's all right. Na na na. 'Cause it's all right. You know
Yeah. So
that's
no,
where
that old, it's old R&B song. I can't remember.
yeah, that's where I cribbed that figure, and there you have.
What about
it was a pretty cool record in the studio because Tony Visconti, who, you know, who wasn't particularly generous with me, he did tell me that he said, "Why don't you double that part?" So I doubled it, and I thought the double was kind of sloppy. You know, and when I went into the control room, I said, "Yeah, I think I could do better." He goes, "Nah, leave it." You know, he goes, you know, he said, "I always tried to get Mark Bolan to redo his doubles because they were always really sloppy, and he would never do it. He was very impatient." And he goes, "And now I hear those records, I just can't imagine them any other way." So I learned to not be so precious about the doubles.
what about Sally Was a Cop, which is on that record and it's also on your new record?
Well, I remember strumming those four chords. There was nothing particularly special about it, and the line started going back and forth, and somewhere along the line, just by Al and I singing and, you know, bouncing words off the walls and trying to figure out if we liked what we heard coming back at us. Somewhere it established that Sally was a cop, now she's a soldier. Another foot deep, another day older. I used to be at the top, now I roll over, and it had that rhyme scheme was established, and I really liked it, you know. And I thought it was pretty great. We made a pretty cool demo of it, and then down the road, I was visiting Alejandro, and we did that in San Francisco, and I was very pleased with the song. And then when down the road, I was visiting Alejandro in Austin, and he said, "Yeah, we got to write another verse for that song. You know, it's a little short." I said, "Good luck." I mean, you're gonna have to cut me open, drag it out. I don't know. You know, I don't see how we can do that. You know, it's pretty much perfect. And of course we did. You know, and yeah, that became a song that I particularly like.
And then why did you want to redo it?
I just felt that it fit into my record. You know, it asserted itself. I mean, I didn't want to do it. It was just too good of an idea. It asserted itself, you know, and also it's a nice guitar. It's a nice song to play guitar on. You know, I enjoyed
Mhm.
playing guitar on it. So it goes over well live, and also shows this sort of a lot of the inspiration lyrically in terms of like 35 bodies lying in the highway and children forced to dig the graves of their fathers. A lot of that kind of violence came from something that I'd heard Cormac McCarthy say. He said that when people asked him, you know, how were you able to imagine such, you know, graphic violence and something like Blood Meridians or whatever, and and this is like the Oprah for, this is when Cormac McCarthy is a hugely established writer. He said, well, I just took a look around at what I saw out there, and I just tried to imagine what it would be like in 20 years, 20 or 30 years. And he said, could you have ever imagined that there would be beheadings on television? And this was when it was happening, Um, and I kind of had that in mind. It's sort of like if the violence in that song isn't true, it will be. It will be eventually.
So you've done a lot of collaboration in your career, both performing and recording and songwriting. And talk a little about Kirk and your other collaborators. Why that works for you? Why you like that sort of back and forth
Well,
interaction?
Kurt, he's never really happy with the way I describe our relationship, but it's the same way I would describe my relationship with Alejandro. Is that when we're in a room together, we just don't really run out of things to talk about. And, that's how a lot of the songs, I've co-written so many songs with Kurt Lipschutz. His pen name is Clipschutz. I've written so many so many songs with Clipschutz, but I don't really recall him coming in with lyrics and jump.
Mm. It's all generated in the moment.
Yeah, in the moment. Ultimately, those are the things that work. Occasionally we try to shoehorn things, and they're not as natural, and they don't come off as conversational. But I remember he came in, one day and said, "My life is an experiment. Doesn't prove it." And I said, I get up in the morning, fill up both my lungs, and I say, "Look out, all you losers, here I come," and so wish me luck. And I remember I completely improvised that like in one whole piece, and that's typical of us. It's just like, when you put those two wires together, when you're charging a battery, that's the way it is when we're in a room together. So,
and
Dan Penn told me, if you're lucky enough to find somebody that you can perform that kind of miracle with, again and again, pretty blessed.
What's his background, and what's he do when he's not working with you?
Well, when I met him, he was a poet, law clerk, in Bohemia here, San Francisco. We were all, trying to work as little and, pursue the arts. And he, was writing songs with a guy that, was part of that early Albion scene, a guy by the name of Bone Coots, great artist. And they wrote songs. And so we ended up writing together, the three of us, and then Kurt and I peeled off and wrote a bunch of songs. And then, we had about a 10-year gap where we didn't speak. I'm sure he could write a book about why, thick one. But eventually, somewhere around the time of Temple Beautiful, which was really after my experience with Alejandro, where I spent like a year writing with Alejandro, Kurt came back into my life, and we wrote an album from scratch called Temple Beautiful.
And there's a musical in the works about that?
Yeah. We've been working on a musical for about 8 years. We've worked with at least one theater company and a couple producers. We've gone through a couple producers. We've got some seed money. We're working with a kind of a dramaturge editor right now, a guy by the name of Gene Core, great screenwriter, taught at Stanford, and also made a movie that I love called Desert Bloom with John Voight. So we're working with him at the moment and rewriting the script, and that's usually followed by table readings, stage readings, and it just takes a lot to get. It takes a lot of doing to get a musical up on its feet.
And what's the plot synopsis?
Well, it's about a guy named JJ Moshpit Josh, who works as a walking tour guide in Union Square, San Francisco. He's dressed up as a 18th century, 19th century kook by the name of Emperor Norton, and he gives walking tours. And let's just say that the emperor has a very complicated relationship with reality, and he and his confederates get hired to do a compulsory San Francisco tour for some new Google employees, and they have a different tour in mind. And it's just a wild ride, you know. It's a wild ride through San Francisco history and punk rock and a lot of great songs, and they're going to make their way back to the Temple Beautiful.
Chuck, you once described Temple Beautiful to me as sort of your version of New York. You know, Lou Reed's 1989 album about the city. How do you still think of it that way?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it would be. I mean, I can't really. I mean, Lou Reed sort of looms large over everything, so I've got to credit him with that. But you know, Kurt and I wrote a mess of songs, and as a kind of reward, I went in and made some demos. And it was then that I realized there were 2 or 3 songs that I thought were San Francisco songs. And I said to Kurt, you know, we could ditch the other ones and keep these 3 and write more and make a San Francisco record, you know, and that could be a really cool way into this. And he was, you know, I don't know if he was thrilled about that initially, because it meant that I wanted to throw away a bunch of songs and start over. But, you know, we tapped into it. And the thing about San Francisco, it just has such a great history. Also, you know, we wrote this in my so-called office, which doesn't have any Wi-Fi, so therefore we didn't have any Google, and we tended to lean on the more mythical version of events, which suited us just fine. You know, so you know we had a lot of villains. You know, Bill Graham and Jim Jones, and gosh, a lot of great villains. And at one point, we realized what this record needs is a hero. Every great myth needs a hero. And so we were pretty much dispirited. We were sitting there looking down at all the takeout menus on the ground, and we were in my office, and we went out for a walk, and we went down to the ballpark where there's a statue of Willie Mays, and we said, okay, there's a no-brainer right there. And we wrote a song called Willie Mays is Up at Bat. So, it was a sort of catalyst for the whole.
Can you talk about Stephanie's role in your music making, as opposed, you know, in addition to your personal relationship?
Well, I mean, I was not that. I was probably a little bit insecure when I went solo as a singer on a lot of levels, you know. And Stephanie was a pretty experienced harmony singer. She'd been in a band with the actress Mare Winningham called the Waybacks. I'd seen them perform, and I thought she was great, you know. And so when we used to have these poker nights at the Albion, you know, she would sing a harmony and play piano. And I said, man, you know, if we got you an accordion, you could stand up and with the rest of us. And so we went down to Mission Street to Mission Pond and got her a red Silvertone accordion. And I just felt like, you know, I didn't have a high opinion of what I was doing. I thought I was pretty good guitar player, you know, songwriter, okay singer. But I felt when I had Stephanie with me, I was a lot better. I was great. That's the way it felt. And so we entered into a romantic relationship as well as, you know, musical collaborators. And, you know, it hasn't all been rainbows and unicorns. You know, there's been a lot of tears along the way, a lot of growing pains, but we've managed to grow as a band. And she's still kind of my rock in many ways, you know. I mean, I remember coming out of my major label deal and a little bit lost. And she's like, yeah, just go out and record yourself hitting the fence with a stick. Just forget it all. Just don't worry about it. Start over, you know? And, I like to get her blessings. I trust her, you know?
Mhm.
And it's one thing to have a professional team around, in terms of management, labels and stuff, but what you really want is believers, you know, people that believe in what you're, and that goes a lot further in my experience. I've had like some management relationships that got pretty sour and, you know, probably didn't help me at all in terms of, you know, being nurtured as an artist, you know. I mean, if I look at my heroes, you know, people like Bruce and Tom Petty and stuff, they all had somebody in their corner who was a true believer. And I think that probably went further than anything. You know, I mean, you definitely get it. You don't have to dig too deep into the Springsteen lore to know that it was John Landau who, you know, put his foot down somewhere around Born to Run and said, look, you're either in or you're in the way. And you'd have thought. And of course, two guys peeled off right about then, you know. But yeah. So she's my believer. She has belief and faith in the process and yeah. And if and she'll let me know if you know, what I'm doing is bullshit or whatever. As a band leader too.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should end it there. This has been a great conversation, and I'm glad I finally got a chance to talk to you.
Well, some days I feel more articulate than others, Jeffrey, and you know, there's a lot to cover. I appreciate the attention from you guys.
Man, you know, you can go so deep with him. And we just talked to him for an hour and scratched the surface. I love talking to him. He's a great conversationalist. The new record is Wake the Dead. It's an album that he does with a band called King Save. And together on this project, they're calling themselves Chuck Prophet and the Cumbia Shoes. It's on Yep Rock Records. Go find it wherever you listen to music. So, Jeffrey, we've had this Hard Right and Pink Cadillac Substack live for a month now. We want to thank all of our subscribers. We've gotten a lot of great support. We really appreciate you. There's a lot of content over there. I just recently wrote a piece. The summer of 2025 marks the 40th anniversary of my first Grateful Dead show in June of 1985. And as you know, Jeffrey, I've had a long history with the Grateful Dead, not only musically, but I've had a chance to work with some of those guys over the years, Phil Lesh and Robert Hunter. And so, you know, I really sort of tried to sum up what it means to be a deadhead for 40 years. Well, tell us more, though, about what you've been putting on the Substack, what you're listening to, what you're reading, what's going on for you.
Right. So what we're doing on Substack is we're posting all these video interviews we're doing with people. This is our third one. We did one on Kevin Gordon was our first one. We did an episode where Mark and I talked about the Springsteen new box set of lost albums. And then this one is our third one. But we also have text articles are there. My chapter on surf music from Steve Van Zant's Teach Rock book is there. I have a new curmudgeon column on Van Morrison. I'm resurrecting my curmudgeon column from all the years I wrote it at Taste magazine. Uh, we have been doing record reviews and movie reviews. Uh, I did a story on John Prellis and then at the New York Times and that whole situation. So there's a lot to read. There's a lot to watch. We have a Spotify playlist for each one of the video podcasts that we do, so you can hear the music that goes along with the conversation. So there's lots of reasons to search us out, sign up for a subscription so you get email notifications. If you feel like we're doing a great job and you want to give us a little support, you can become a paid subscriber. That'd be great, but it's not necessary. So thank you, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time, everybody. Thanks.